The garage door slid upward just as the morning mist dissolved over the asphalt, exposing a machine that few outside the absolute inner circle of Grand Prix racing had ever laid eyes on. Resting on its rear paddock stand inside the Pramac Yamaha pit box was a radical, highly secretive prototype that defied decades of Japanese engineering tradition. This wasn't the agile, predictable machine that had carried past legends to world titles. Tucked beneath the sharp carbon fiber bodywork was a lethal, high-horsepower V4 engine, representing a multi-million-dollar gamble to dismantle European dominance. But as the engineers calibrated the electronics, all eyes in the paddock veered away from the mechanical architecture and shifted toward the figure zipping up his leather suit in the corner. Toprak Razgatlıoğlu had arrived. The reigning World Superbike Champion, a titan who had treated standard production-based machinery like an extension of his own limbs, was about to mount an uncompromised racing beast. The atmosphere was thick with palpable tension. Insiders knew that this official Catalunya test session was not a standard exploratory run. It was a high-stakes baptism by fire. The pressure on Yamaha to deliver immediate developmental answers was staggering, and Toprak was stepping directly into the crosshairs of a critical developmental timeline. Every eye in the surrounding garages tracked his movement as he climbed onto the machine and gripped the handlebars. The public expected instant, miraculous lap times from a rider of his caliber, yet the engineering crew felt a deep, silent anxiety. They knew the prototype had already left experienced Grand Prix riders physically exhausted and technically perplexed during early season shakedowns. As the starter motor whined and the V4 engine roared to life with an aggressive, earth-shaking rumble, a quiet settle fell over the crew chief. No one inside the paddock expected what would unfold over the next few hours, and it would completely rewrite the expectations for this rider, his new team, and the entire remainder of the season. For over 20 years, Yamaha's entire racing philosophy was anchored to the fluid precision of an inline-four engine configuration. It was a blueprint that prioritized high corner speed, predictable chassis behavior, and an almost intuitive connection between the rider's wrist and the rear asphalt. But modern Grand Prix racing had evolved into a game of violent acceleration and complex aerodynamic dependency. To stay alive, the factory had to tear down its own legacy. The birth of the V4 powerplant completely altered the physical geometry of the motorcycle, forcing the technical department to fundamentally redistribute the mass. The machine was now shorter, narrower, and delivered an explosive punch of horsepower that sent shockwaves through the aluminum chassis frame. When Toprak launched down the pit lane for his opening run, the change was instantly visible. The motorcycle accelerated with a savage, unrelenting force, lifting its front wheel off the deck even with advanced winglets fighting to preserve downforce. On-track observers noted that the machine looked incredibly volatile, snapping and weaving as it transferred its massive torque to the rear tire. Inside the garage, telemetry engineers stared at their monitors in absolute silence as the data traces began to paint a terrifying picture. The theoretical numbers calculated by supercomputers in Japan were clashing directly with the raw reality of a rider attempting to survive on the circuit. The power delivery was simply too aggressive, overriding the sophisticated electronic control strategies and putting an immense physical strain on the newcomer. Toprak was forcing his body into positions that worked perfectly on a production-based frame, but the Grand Prix prototype refused to comply. It demanded absolute stiffness, a radical aerodynamic load balance, and a riding style that left zero margin for error. As the morning progressed, the initial excitement evaporated, replaced by the staggering realization that this newly bred beast possessed unbridled chaos beneath its skin. As Toprak guided the prototype back into the pit box after a brief four-lap run, his body language shifted from confident focus to intense concentration. He immediately began making rapid, sweeping gestures with his hands, mimicking a loose front end and a sudden loss of traction. The technical team huddled close, notebooks open, capturing every piece of feedback. The core problem wasn't just the sheer brutality of the engine. It was how that power interacted with the hypersensitive Grand Prix control tires. For years, Toprak had conquered championships on production-based rubber, which offered a wide operating window and predictable feedback when pushed to the absolute edge. MotoGP, however, operated on a completely different technical plane. The specialized front tires provided by the official supplier were a mysterious form of black magic. They required an immense specific load to generate maximum grip, but if a rider crossed that microscopic threshold by even a millimeter, the tire would suffer a sudden, catastrophic washout without a split second of warning. To make matters worse, the scorching afternoon sun had pushed the Catalunya asphalt temperature up to a punishing level, turning the track into a greasy, low-grip surface. Toprak's greatest weapon had always been his late, incredibly violent braking style, often entering corners with the rear wheel completely hovering in the air. But as he tried to apply that exact same philosophy to the prototype, the sensitive carcass of the control tire overloaded instantly. The compound degraded within just 3 laps, destroying any sense of front-end feel and forcing him to run wide at nearly every major turning point. Mechanics adjusted the front fork preload and shifted weight distribution toward the front axle, attempting to stabilize the footprint, but the telemetry continued to show erratic pressure spikes. Toprak was fighting his own muscle memory, discovering that the very technique that made him a world champion was being neutralized by a few square centimeters of rubber. By mid-afternoon, a heavy silence had descended over the garage. Toprak sat in the rear corner of the pit box, his helmet resting on a bench, staring blankly at the timing monitors. His name was buried deep within the lower mid-pack, trailing the leading pace by a significant margin. Paddock whispers began spreading down the pit lane like wildfire, with rival team managers questioning whether Yamaha's high-profile recruit was hitting an insurmountable technical wall. Some insiders claimed that his extreme riding style was fundamentally incompatible with the rigid, highly synchronized demands of a modern Grand Prix prototype. The psychological pressure was compounding with every passing minute. A champion accustomed to standing on the top step of the podium was now forced to look at a digital screen that suggested he was completely out of his depth. Behind closed doors, project managers discussed whether they had rushed the developmental process, wondering if they had handed an untamed animal to a rider who was still trying to learn the basic vocabulary of the class. The communication between Toprak and his crew chief grew increasingly intense. They weren't just adjusting mechanical clickers anymore, they were debating the core geometry of the machine. The team tried switching to a harder tire compound to cope with the heat, but the change only made the chassis feel stiffer, transmitting harsh vibrations directly through the handlebars. Every adjustment seemed to lead down a technical dead end, and the data suggested that the rider was losing confidence in the one area he needed it most, the entry phase of the corner. The grand narrative of a flawless, triumphant transition was crumbling under the harsh reality of the stopwatch, leaving team executives wondering if their multi-million-dollar gamble was on the verge of a public breakdown. With the clock ticking down toward the final hour of the test session, management realized that continuing down their current path would result in total failure. The specialized setup they had tailored for Toprak's unique style was broken. In a decisive, high-stakes move, the technical director ordered the mechanics to completely strip the prototype's chassis and throw out the custom geometry. Instead, they loaded a direct clone of the setup files utilized by factory star Fabio Quartararo during his recent breakthrough run. This was a massive psychological gamble. Quartararo's setup required a hypersmooth, highly precise corner entry line that relied on maximum lean angle and flawless momentum, the absolute polar opposite of Toprak's natural racing instincts. The mechanics worked at a furious pace, swapping out the carbon fiber swing arm links, altering the rake and trail dimensions, and remapping the entire electronic engine braking strategy to match the factory rider's telemetry. Toprak watched the transformation in silence, recognizing the vulnerability of the situation. To find a baseline rhythm, he would have to completely abandon his racing identity and mimic another man's philosophy. When he finally rode back onto the circuit with the cloned configuration, the initial laps felt incredibly foreign. He could no longer rely on his trademark violent braking to rotate the bike. He had to trust the front tire to carry massive speed through the center of the apex. It was a complete re-education at 200 miles per hour. Yet, as his tires scrubbed in, something unexpected began to surface on the timing monitors. The stopwatch never lies, and as Toprak completed his third lap on the factory setup, the numbers shifted from frustrating to fascinating. He wasn't setting explosive single-lap records, but his sector times suddenly leveled out into a highly consistent, competitive rhythm. The wild, snapping motions of the chassis had dissipated, replaced by a smooth, controlled arc through the long, sweeping corners of the Catalunya circuit. The electronic remapping had successfully tamed the initial hit of the V4 engine, allowing the rear tire to hook up without instantly destroying the compound. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the grandstands, casting long shadows across the front straightaway, Toprak began pushing the limits of the new configuration. He was opening the throttle significantly earlier on corner exits, utilizing the massive horsepower of the V4 powerplant to launch down the straights with precise stability. Inside the garage, the tense atmosphere broke into a collective sigh of relief. The data traces on the monitors smoothed out, showing a beautiful, linear progression that closely mirrored the factory team's baseline. Toprak was adapting, not by losing his speed, but by blending his natural bike control with the disciplined requirements of the prototype. He completed a grueling 12-lap simulation, and while rival teams noticed a drop in overall track activity due to changing wind conditions, the white and blue machine kept clicking off identical, highly competitive lap times. The rider who looked completely lost just 2 hours prior had found a way to bridge the technical chasm, proving that his understanding of a motorcycle went far deeper than anyone in the paddock had estimated. When the checkered flag finally brought the grueling test session to an official close, Toprak rode back into the pit lane, his leathers coated in light dust and tire rubber. As he pulled up to the garage, he didn't look defeated. He climbed off the machine and immediately pointed to the data screens with a subtle, knowing smile. The final analysis of the afternoon data revealed a critical breakthrough that would shape the factory's entire winter program. Toprak's unique sensitivity had allowed him to pinpoint microvibrations in the chassis that standard digital telemetry had completely missed, providing engineers with the exact feedback required to refine the V4's power delivery map. This test session was never about topping the sheets or chasing instant internet headlines. It was an exercise in survivability and deep technical weaponization. Yamaha had entered the day with an incredibly fast but dangerously unpredictable prototype, and they were leaving with a clear, definitive development direction. The collaboration between a humbled champion and a desperate engineering squad had finally produced a shared language. The paddock observers who had predicted a disaster hours earlier were now quietly rewriting their scripts for the upcoming season, recognizing that the V4 project had just cleared its most dangerous psychological hurdle. As the mechanics began cleaning the carbon fiber bodywork and packing away the tire warmers, the weight of the morning pressure gave way to an exhausting satisfaction. The journey to the top of the Grand Prix world was bound to be filled with immense setbacks and brutal learning curves. But on this hot asphalt under the Barcelona sky, the blue brand had officially laid down the blueprint for their future.